Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to make a start on the Tamiya Sand Scorcher. This one's a re-release of course, but it's all classic Tamiya with lots of nice chunky metal parts. As usual, we're going to start slow in this video, going through some of the basics of a Tamiya build. Then in the next videos we'll cruise through the rest of the build. Right, here we go then. On opening the manual we find the list of required items. Basically, we need a transmitter and receiver for control, a standard size servo for steering, and a battery. Now the kit needs a smaller than your typical 6L 9mm battery. Now I'm still trying to work out exactly what to do there, but the plan is to set it up with a more typical 2200 mAh 2S LiPo. The good news though, if you buy a starter kit from a model shop, it should come with all the bits you need. Next then we have the tools. We're going to need some JIS drivers. Now you can get away with Phillips, but if you can find a JIS set, it makes life so much easier. Going to need some side cutters or flush cutters for cutting the parts from the parts trees. Tweezers come in handy here and there too. Some pliers for gripping things. Now, a normal pair and a needle nose usually does the trick. Unusually for a Tamiya kit, this one uses quite a few Allen head screws. Now Tamiya do include some small Allen keys which will do the job, but since there's quite a few, I'd get yourself some Allen drivers. A set with a 1.5, 2 and 2.5mm bit will cover most RC eventualities. You'll also want something for doing up nuts, but the Tamiya cross wrench in the kit is perfectly good. The next page mentions some safety advice no one ever looks at, and some info on what makes up the RC gear. Over the page we get into the fun stuff, the build. Usually Tamiya kits start with something a bit boring like servo arms, but here we're straight in with the gearbox. Awesome if you know what you're doing, but maybe a bit daunting if this is your first kit. Before you go headlong into the pile of parts in the box, we've got a couple of things to do. On the left of the diagram we have a list of the hardware for the build step. Here we have some screws, grub screws, a shaft and some bearings. All of them are actual size, so you can do a quick compare to make sure you've got the right bits. Plus each one has a part number. The screws are BB1, which tells us they're in bag B. And speaking of bags, we have 4 main hardware bags, A, B, C and D. To make it easier to dig around for parts, we'll decant all the bits into 4 pudding pots. You can write on the pots if you like, or just keep them in order off to the side of the build area. Now not all the parts are in the marked bags. Some are in blank bags like this one. A number of the parts in step 1 come from this particular one. It's no big deal though. If you look at the diagram, it's pretty clear which bits you need. So since you've got this one out, we might as well start collecting parts. We're going to need BH1, 2 and 6. They're the 3 shafts the gears run on in the gearbox. BH6 is also listed on the left. All the other bits can go off to the side until we need them. In another unmarked bag we can see the 2 plastic gears we need, BJ6 and 8. We'll put all the other bits in a pudding pot for safekeeping. Next we can find the bearings, which unlike a lot of Tamiya kits are proper ball-raced bearings, so we're not going to need an aftermarket kit. Rather than being hidden away in a bag, the bearings are in the blister pack that greets you when you first open the box. So we'll cut them free and fish out 6 bearings. Also in the blister pack are the 2 universal joints, or UJs, and the rather awesome gearbox halves, which just leaves the M3x18 cap heads, BB1s, which we find in bag B, and we're going to need 7 of them. And from bag C we need 2 5x5 grub screws. And well, that's it for the prep. We have all the parts to build up step 1. We'll also need some grease and thread lock, but we'll get to those in a minute. Or we would, except I think the memory card in the camera is on its way out. I got some rather nasty errors the camera couldn't fully recover from, so there's a little bit of missing video. We'll do our best though. Right, as you can see I've built up the 3 shafts as per the manual. Essentially it's just a case of pressing the gears into place and popping a bearing on either side. The only one to watch out for is the idler in the middle. The gear has a small flange on each side, but they're slightly different widths. You need to make sure it's the right way round. And after another bit of missing video, we have the two halves of the gearbox pressed together. Now, two things happened in the lost footage. First, we added some of the grease the kit comes with to the gears. You don't need a vast amount, just enough to coat all the teeth. You can add some, then spin the input shaft and watch the grease find its way around before closing up the gearbox. Second, and a bit more difficult to explain, we added some thread lock to the 7 threaded holes that the screws are going to be threaded into. Essentially, what we do is use a cocktail stick to take a spot of thread lock from the bottle, which is another thing. I don't tend to use the kit gel thread lock, I prefer liquid. Either way, once you've got it on the cocktail stick, we pop it into the threaded holes and give it a stir. Adding the thread lock to the hole rather than a screw usually ends up with a much cleaner build. Otherwise you end up getting it pretty much everywhere, making a right mess. When you're fitting the screws, start by taking up the slack of all 7, then go from one side to the other, nipping them all up. Generally, it makes for a nicer build, as all the bits can find their position rather than immediately being clamped up tight. This gearbox is pretty good though, so it's not all that critical. But it's a good habit to get into. Start loose, then tighten once all the bits are in place. Next we can give the shafts a quick twist to see how they feel. For the first few turns they might feel slightly notchy or a bit grainy as the grease moves around, but it should start to feel nice and smooth and free moving. If they're stiff or it's like a bag of gravel, take the gearbox apart and double check all the bits. Right, that just leaves the 2 UJs. Now the manual wants us to use some thread lock on the grub screws, but we won't be doing that just yet. To make sure they're in just the right position, we're going to need to loosen them up again. And by the way, that's the liquid thread lock that I use. You would have seen it earlier if the memory card hadn't had its errors. To fit the UJs, we just thread the grub screw in a couple of turns, offer it up to the output of the gearbox, lining the grub screw up with the flat on the shaft, and then we tighten it up. Repeat on the other side, and that's step 1 complete. What we end up with is a very nice old school gearbox. It's never going to compete with some of the newer kits in performance, but just look at it. There's really something about these Tamiya kits. So that's the build intro complete. Next time we'll drop into top gear and really get on with things. We'll see how far we can get through the rear suspension with all its quirky bits. In the meantime, thanks for watching and putting up with the lost footage. Like if you like, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!